Welcome back to Litigation Help. My name is Heather Hui-Litwin, and today we're going to talk about what couples should consider in a marriage or cohabitation contract. You may have heard about how some couples go through costly legal battles upon separation. And in fact, some legal professionals have suggested that this could be avoided if they had set up a marriage contract or cohabitation contract in the first place. So even though you might not be comfortable going through the contract route, it may be worthwhile to discuss these topics beforehand. And if you do decide on doing a contract, it's best to talk these things out while things are still going well between the two of you. But what exactly should couples consider? So joining me here are our regular guests, Tarcea and Eva DiGiammarino from Family Mediation Group. Laura is a family mediator, and Eva is a family lawyer and mediator, and both have appeared as guest speakers in previous videos on this channel about family mediation. If you've missed those, I have prepared some links in the description box below. Laura and Eva, thank you so much for coming in today.
Thank you for having us.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. So, Eva, maybe I can start with you. So what are some of the topics that one should consider in a marriage contract?
Sure. And so let's just start from the real basics. What is a marriage contract, right? So a marriage contract, or what we would call a cohabitation agreement, they're kind of interchangeable. A cohabitation agreement is the contract that two people who live together but are not legally married. That's the contract that outlines their responsibilities to each other and what happens if they break up. What happens to their joint property and their rights for spousal support. If you're married, then the cohabitation agreement turns into a marriage contract. Oftentimes, families will live together before they get married. They'll get a cohabitation agreement. And then once they get married, they don't have to redo the cohabitation agreement. It just turns into a marriage contract. In Canada, we use the terms cohabitation agreement and marriage contract. But in the United States, they often use the term prenup. I think let's take a bird's eye view, or kind of a macro view in terms of the topics of an agreement. Whether it's a cohabitation agreement or a marriage contract, they generally deal with two main areas. One is spousal support. So when two parties break up, does one person owe the other spousal support? And if the answer is yes, it can be as detailed as identifying how much and for how long, or it can be a waiver to say it doesn't matter what happens if we break up, no spousal support. It can also identify what happens when one person wants to leave a relationship. That's especially important if one person is the sole owner of the home, right? So it can say, well, if one person breaks up with the other, if that person's the homeowner, the other person has to leave within 60 days or 90 days, for example. That homeowner, if they break up with the other person, may have to pay them something so that they leave and get their own place. So you can consider that. So spousal support, the circumstances of the breakup, and then asset division. So if you're legally married, then your marriage contract will identify how you're going to divide your assets, and you can exclude and include certain assets in that. We can talk about that in more detail. If you're not legally married, then the contract is going to focus on how you divide your jointly owned assets. So those are the three main kind of areas that a cohabitation agreement or a marriage contract would identify. The circumstances of the breakup and what happens right after, spousal support, and property division.
If you're not legally married, then you want to consider the joint assets, what to do with the joint assets.
That's right, because if you're a common law, depending on how long you're a common law family for, but generally common law families do not split individual assets upon a breakup. They only split joint assets. Now, of course, there's caveats to that. If the common law family has been together for 18 years or more, there may be justification in the law for them to divide independently owned assets. The cohabitation agreement would identify that, well, here we have a family that is common law. They may not ever intend to marry. So if they break up under 18 years together, what happens, right? Do they just confirm that they only divide their joint assets? Or do they confirm, hey, you know what? Instead of 18 years, when we hit the 10-year mark, we want to divide individual assets. You can come up with whatever arrangement you want. But essentially, if you're not legally married, you're only really dividing joint assets unless you contract otherwise. And if you are legally married, you're dividing individual and joint assets unless you contract otherwise.
It probably would be a good idea, right, to consult a legal professional while drafting this up. But it has to be a lawyer though, probably, right?
It would be critical for both parties, in my opinion, to have some type of legal advice before they sign a document. However, even better, both lawyers should draft the agreement, although I am open to the fact that you may not need a lawyer for every part of it. Laura and I often have families who negotiate terms of their separation agreement, which is the other side, right? When they're divorcing or separating, they often negotiate without lawyers and they can do very well. But in order to do that, you have to understand what your rights are, right? And the rights going into a relationship can be fairly convoluted and complex. So because of that, I would recommend that the drafting and the assistance comes from a lawyer.
So not only is it important to know what topics to discuss, you should also do a little bit of your research or speak to a legal professional about what rights you have, what rights you have.
Absolutely, because the whole function of a cohabitation agreement in a marriage is to identify your rights upon a breakup.
Right.
And oftentimes people will change their rights, right? So they'll either waive their right to something or they'll identify certain rights in the agreement. You have to know what you'd be entitled to in order to agree to it fairly.
These contracts are they speak to the breakup. Do people have contracts that govern during the relationship? I'm just kind of like thinking out loud here.
That's a very good question.
Is there such a thing?
So generally, no.
Right.
Ontario and Canada in general, our contracts are a lot less flexible. So for example, in the United States, we hear often of very unique, I should say, clauses that go into prenups. For example, there have been fairly problematic, in my opinion, but clauses like if one person gains weight, what happens, right? Or if one person, infidelity clauses are still common here, but they're much more common in the United States. Like, so if some person is caught cheating, they, don't get certain property rights, right? In Ontario, there's a lot less of that. You really can't control someone's behavior during a relationship with a contract. It's not really done here. So you can't say like, hey, if you don't do the dishes, you're not going to get spousal support. Can't do that.
Now, just some of the technical requirements. Actually, before I even get there, I wanted to ask some couples they think, oh, we're really getting along well, and we're not antagonistic right now at this moment. Can't we just share a lawyer? Can't we just hire you guys, and just help us draft a contract? Is that a good idea? Or just to save money, because young couples, they don't have a lot of money to spare. So can they just share a lawyer?
No, they can't share a lawyer.
Oh, darn.
They can certainly, if they are looking to save money and time and get legal information, they can go through mediation and get the information, but ultimately, and save money on working with a lawyer, and having the full process through lawyer-led negotiation as opposed to mediation, so they can save money that way.
Right.
But ultimately, they should receive legal advice, especially either in the beginning or at the very end when they're about to sign the contract, because as Eva had mentioned earlier, knowing your rights is very important. Also knowing what you are what it is and it is not, or could not be enforceable, what clauses in a contract. So in Ontario, for example, certain departments such as for child responsibility, parenting rights are, you can't, someone may think, well, if we have children, I want to put that in a contract. I want to put clauses that, I keep the children or you keep the children, or the children's schedule will be shared. Well, that is not an enforceable clause. So that's when legal advice would be pertinent for these families to know, so that they don't engage into something that, regardless, is just they get to that point in life and it's not enforceable, so they just waste it at that time, money and time and mental capacity. So yeah, I mean, that's that's how you can save. If you want to save money, that's how you can save money, as opposed to not having your own lawyer. You should have your own lawyer at the end.
Oh, but if you don't have your independent legal advice, would the courts not recognize that these are binding and valid contracts? Are the courts that harsh?
It is a very, very complex process, and it's a complex question. In a nutshell, tips for having a strong contract would include independent legal advice. That is one of the ingredients to having ultimately a strong contract. Another one would be that this agreement was entered into voluntarily. So neither one has been forced or coerced to agree to certain clauses or terms in the agreement, and they understand what the clauses are and the consequences of entering. Now, another one is fairness. So how fair is it? And balanced the agreement is, and then the clear, and that there's the language has to be specific. Now, if all of those ingredients, or the more ingredients you have, the stronger the agreement is. So the answer is not necessarily categorically no. It's not going to be enforceable, but it will depend on all the other elements that have formed part of signing or getting to the terms of the agreement. If you are not going to have independent legal advice, then the other ingredients should be included. Another big one that I forgot to mention is also full financial disclosure. So financial disclosure has to happen, regardless whether you are into you're entering a contract, a marriage or a cohab contract or a separation agreement. You should have full financial disclosure. Those are some of the elements that, when missing, could lead to an invalidity of a contract.
Because the judge is going to say, well, this person didn't know what they were signing to, like they didn't even know the context, the background, and how much you had and that kind of thing. That makes sense.
Right.
When the couple start off just cohabiting and they have a cohabitation contract and then they get married, do they have to change it? Like, I mean, once they get married, can they just leave it the way it is? If that's okay?
Yeah, ideally, when they're drafting the cohabitation agreement, the lawyers that they'll work with will have them consider terms that come into place when they get married. And that therefore they could just get married without changing it unless there's an issue. But yeah, usually it's done in contemplation to say, if they get married, these things change or these things stay the same. That way you don't have to go back.
Oh, that's good.